Welcome to the DRF Sports Podcast, brought to you by DRF Sports. America's most trusted name in horse racing is now providing sports bettors with exclusive data, analytics, previews, videos, and expert picks on all major sports. Bet smarter and have more fun doing it. It's the DRF Sports Podcast, and now your host, Sheldon Alexander. Ready, set, bet.
This is the DRF Sports Podcast, episode 7. Make sure you like and follow wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander. A reminder, we do this twice a week on Tuesdays and Fridays, talking football and gambling. We're coming off a huge win by the Cowboys on Monday Night Football, and a pick that we actually gave out on the pod last Friday, where Matt convinced me to switch over from the Eagles. But that's just what we do here. An 8-2 week against the spread in terms of picks we gave out on the pod. The NCAA hurry-up offense picks were on fuego in terms of 11-6 record there. And that's before I even mentioned Matt calling Clemson getting upset by NC State. Now, if you're wondering why I'm always telling you to check out drf.com/sports, it's because that's where you can get all of the details and insights, including power trends, line movements, team stats, and even more betting angles, including Scott Grambling's weekly six-pack. Scott was hitting underdogs all over the place in both the NFL and NCAA, including outright wins in Notre Dame and Arkansas in college, and the Chargers and Saints in the NFL. The point is, drf.com/sports is where you need to be every single day for all of our previews. Plus, we deep dive into the games each and every week on the podcast. Basically, however you want your betting information, we've got you covered. And on today's show, after another amazing week of picks, I'm just going to keep bringing them back for more. And so my dude, Matt Russell, joins me on the show right about now. Well, I look up on a Tuesday morning coming off of a 10-6 week. I'm 31-17 overall this season, but I'm not going to lie. Thanks in most part to listening to this guy on each and every Fridays. He converted me, and I'm guessing some of our listeners, to more than one pick here and there, including Monday Night Football. I came in on the Eagles and you were like, no, I don't think you want to do that. You're very polite on it, but hey, converted me over. The picks that we gave out on the pod last Friday, 8-2 in the NFL picks, including a bunch of teams that were just live to win as outright underdogs. That was on the pod. Then we'll add in the 11-6 record in the hurry up offense, including quite possibly the biggest upset of the year in college football as Clemson goes down to NC State. So much more going on. Mr. Matt Russell, I'm running out of breath bigging you up. Well, that's just how hype I am on this Tuesday morning that I'm happy to have you back on the pod. My dude, how are you doing after yet another great gambling weekend?
I'm good. The big question, you answered it already, right? Like, I was so worried. I'm like, did he switch over to Dallas? I'm watching that game, and they're just, up and down the field on the Eagles, which we talked about, right? If Andy Dalton was able to execute the Kellen Moore offensive game plan last year against the Eagles, why wouldn't Dak be able to do it? He was able to do it. And of course, the Cowboys got just enough defense and made us both winners. And that's obviously awesome. It's funny, right? You mentioned the 8-2 record and like the mind of the bettor, right? The mind of the sports gambler. Immediately, I go to not even the 2, right? The 2, that's going to happen. But I think of the 8 and the Miami Dolphins coming so close to winning outright and sending everybody home with a ton of money when it came to, round robin money line parlays and whatnot. So, you always, unfortunately, you always have to focus on the negative. But as you said, bigging me up, can we just put like jelly beans in a jar, right? And just sort of like give me some credit there so that I can grab those jelly beans later when maybe a week doesn't go that well. And I can sit there and it's just something fungible, right? To have sitting there going like, no, but look, I have all these jelly beans that you guys gave me from earlier on in the season. like these are still worth something, aren't they? Because, that's what happens, right? There will be a week where we come in and we're wiping sweat from our brow from a 3-7 Sunday where we get worked over. And that's just the nature of the game. And so you have to kind of keep expectations in check, so to speak here. But yeah, let's keep the energy, right? Let's just keep it going. There's nothing to say we couldn't keep it going, but let's just, make sure everybody's doing everything responsibly out there. And that I at least keep some credit for later on when things might not go as well as the season gets more difficult.
If you know me and you've known me for a while, I'm going to take the good times when they come, because I know there's going to be some days, some Tuesdays where it's not going to be like this. So I'm going to enjoy this when I can. But I want to touch on the Cowboys game just for a little bit. I don't want to spend a lot of time here because there's not a lot to really talk about. But you made me laugh when you said the Kellen Moore offense, because I don't know which broadcast people were watching, but I found it hilarious on the Eli and Peyton broadcast. They were talking about how great of a job Mike McCarthy has done, because he didn't come in. Most head coaches come in and they'll try to change the offense and change this and change that. And instead, Mike McCarthy was like, no, it's cool. Let's let everything just run with Kellen Moore's offense, because we want to have Dak be comfortable. We don't want to switch things up for Dak too much coming off the injury and blah, blah, blah. And I'm listening to that and I'm just like, why do I get the feeling that Mike McCarthy's just not that good? And he was just like, well, my offense sucks anyways and whatever. And then I'm thinking, am I being too hard on Mike McCarthy? And then you see his clock management at the end of the first half. Yeah. And I'm like, no, a guy has no idea what he's doing.
Yeah. Imagine getting so much credit for just not firing somebody, right? Like you take the job and you don't fire like the best guy on the staff, and like you get credit for that. Like that's an incredible way to live your life. Now, I mean, this is a guy, and we've talked about this before, who came into the interview and just flat out lied about learning analytics, which is, again, hilarious because he's sitting there trying to figure out, should I call timeout? Should I not call timeout? And it's like, that really felt like it was probably day one of your learning analytics tutorial that you allegedly took. But of course, he also admitted that he basically lied about that. And again, somehow didn't get fired. So yeah, the Mike McCarthy thing is probably what's going to hold the Cowboys back, because it's not always going to be, 40-point outbursts. And there's probably going to be a close game here or there that they're going to need to win if they're going to have any sort of, macro success this season. So hilarious watching him, but awesome to watch the Cowboys work on offense, especially if you have laid the points with the Cowboys. And you know me, right? We're loath to give any points. You were certainly looking when it comes to the Eagles. Eagles were a very popular underdog, which is always kind of a red flag there as well. And so, yeah, happy to watch them run up and down the field on the Eagles last night, given the fact that we were laying a few points and didn't want to have to sweat it.
Exactly. So I thank you for converting me and some of our listeners for sure. As you mentioned, very popular pick. But here's the thing. Cowboys roll on Monday night, super easy. But I want to start with how you gave us a bunch of underdogs that won outright on Sunday. And in fact, one game off from the underdog round robin money line parlays, which I'm loving. I think I called you in the middle of Sunday afternoon just to be like, this is amazing. This is amazing. Let's talk about your boy, Jacoby Brissett and the Dolphins, because on the one hand, I didn't want to be too greedy. He covered the 4 points for me and I'm okay with that. I'll take that dub against the spread, but he was so close to having you Scrooge McDuck another 5 for 5 on these underdogs here. Right. And on the one hand, I'm like, can I really be mad? It's Jacoby Brissett. Like he was doing a lot on Sunday, but what was your takeaway from that game?
Yeah, my takeaway is just never call. Because it's 14-0 when you call, and you're like, I love this. I'm having the time of my life. Like we've already cashed the 3 from earlier on, so we're just free rolling everything. And you're like, this is the best. I don't know how I ever lived before this. That might be a slight exaggeration, but yeah, it's 14-0. We're rolling along there, and everything's great. And yeah, then it sort of falls apart, and it's funny again.
Well, hold on. Screen pass on your own goal line didn't help.
The swing, and it's just like, let's check it down here to a guy 3 yards deep in the end zone. That's not great. And yeah, does that cost it? Obviously we get the doink off the bar at the end of the first half. Anyway, a lot of stuff goes wrong, but then you get to a point where you're like, oh my God, the Raiders are the team that's going to cover here. And, I don't know, bad beat or right side, wrong side or whatever, right? I think our thesis in general was correct about the Dolphins and the over exaggeration there when it came to the point spread, right? The overreaction. And that ended up allowing us to cash on that, against the spread, because if that is 2.5, the way that it should have been, a couple of different things happen. One, maybe we don't even bet it, right? Because that's a fair price. And so it's these overreactions that, we talk about, switching picks from Philly to Dallas and helping your ledger from that standpoint. But sometimes the market's going to help your ledger, right? Sometimes the market is going to go across that 3. And then when the game lands 3, that's the difference in that game. So, as we go along through the rest of the season, though, it gets trickier, right? Because the market gets smarter. We get more aware of some of these teams. And, there's a pretty decent example this week of Baltimore at Denver. And if that game's in week 1, I feel like Baltimore is a 3.5 point favorite. And you can then, sit here and see some value on Denver as an underdog, right? And they would be in the money line parlay and all of that sort of thing. And now that line is down to like 1.5, and they're just, it isn't the same, right? You don't have that same value proposition. And, the market has seen 3 games and now knows. And so these money line parlays in general get harder to do because the spreads get more accurate, right? The teams are more appropriately favored than they are early on in the season. So it's nice that we got at least 5 out of 5 in week 1, 4 out of 5 last week. And we're able to sort of grab a bunch of doubloons in our bag. We didn't get the full silo treatment this weekend. But as far as Brissett is concerned, like completely functional. Like, was the offense going to look that much different again, with Tua? Sorry, but I just don't see that being the case. And I think, if you want an early bet for Sunday, I'm grabbing Miami. -1 for like a little bit of extra price there. Like, I think it's about -115 you can get. I'll grab that now because kind of nothing good can come for the Colts, this week, because you got a guy who just played on 2 sprained ankles in Carson Wentz and looked exactly like a guy who's playing with 2 sprained ankles. And so if there's any re-aggravation, or they're just like, you know what, we can't even bother with this, that line has to go up. So as far as early bets for Sunday, it's worth mentioning Dolphins again, go back to it, right? Again, the value is still there with the Dolphins and Jacoby Brissett.
Yeah, that was our biggest part of the conversation in discussing that game, right? Just the difference between Tua and Brissett. And we thought with the full week of practice, does the drop-off in reality match the drop-off in perception, right? Yeah. And people assume, oh, no Tua, Jacoby Brissett. And you got me on the whole, how many starts has he had? And you're seeing, when you watch the game, my guy's just serviceable. And
yes.
Right? And that gets you a lot. Gets you a lot. But as mentioned, gambling margins are so slim. Crazy action on Sunday in the NFL. You mentioned Justin Tucker saving survivor pools everywhere, banking in a 66-yard game-winning field goal. We'll get to that in a bit. We're all over the Lions 8-point spread there as they covered. But there's so many other wild finishes. And I kind of need to discuss with you the Sunday nighter and my Niners. They lose to the Packers. And I can't lie, for the blip that it was in an overall great weekend, this one kind of really hurt my feelings, because sitting there watching the Niners and you see everything in the structure of what they do being correct, like the structure is there.
Yeah.
But there were 2 big things that stood out to me. One, Jimmy Garoppolo's happy feet. He's never confident in the pocket. 2, running backs don't matter. And I agree with you there. But when they got to like their 5th running back and my guy just doesn't hit holes hard, you're just thinking, okay, I see what Shanahan's doing here, but there are some blips here in terms of the boy genius head coach. What were your takeaways from watching that game other than Aaron Rodgers? Don't you just love being romantic about football, or whatever the hell he said?
You're right. Moneyball reference from Raj. Listen, we could probably do an entire podcast just on this game, in part because, listen, I'll give you credit, right? You lasted this far before mentioning the Sunday night football game. And I don't know that necessarily would have been the case if we had done the same Monday morning, and you're still a little hot as a San Francisco 49ers fan. So handful of things, right? You're absolutely right about the running back situation. It's funny that, the broadcast, especially Collinsworth, he'll sort of allude to things in just a really diplomatic way, right? He'll talk about how the San Francisco 49ers are, trying to tell Trey Sermon, who's a very shifty guy, like compliment. They're trying to tell him, just put your foot in the ground, one cut and go, which has been a Shanahan, and I say Shanahan as a last name because both he and his father, it has been a staple of their offense, right? You take one cut and then you just hit the hole and then you go. None of this stop, start juking around back there type stuff, right? So that's an element. But you mentioned Jimmy G, and I got to rein you in. I got to rein everybody in because it isn't just you, because it was just a sea of Trey Lance, here we go. We need this. And I just sort of go, okay, a couple of different things. One, the offensive line's not getting it done. So when you talk about the happy feet, it's you watch Dak Prescott getting in the end zone, right? That looked very Jimmy G-like. But you know what that looked like? That looked like a professional quarterback getting overwhelmed by a defensive line that was not getting blocked on that specific play, right? And so the problem with Jimmy G is that he's surprised, and maybe he's been spoiled by really good offensive line play as he got to San Francisco a couple of years ago, and has been able to sort of statue it back there, make his reads, and hit his throws, because he also doesn't get any credit for good throws, right? He was ripping some yesterday and it was silence on the internet, never going oh, what a great throw. And even the pick by Jair Alexander was actually a really good throw, but sometimes you have to give credit to the other team, right? And so there's some throws there that aren't, some interceptions that aren't necessarily Jimmy G's fault, but when it looks ugly, for whatever reason, well, here's the reason. The reason is Trey Lance is sitting there. Right. That's why people go, oh, if Dak Prescott had somebody sitting behind him like that, the Cowboys, of course, would never do Dak Prescott like that. But if he did, right, you'd be oh, my God, fumble in the end zone. What is he trying to do there? Right. That was a very Jimmy G like play. So the issue is the Trey Lance conversation, right? And it's more than just should he start, should he not, because he absolutely should not start. I don't believe for 1 second that the intricacies of that offense allow for Trey Lance to have a handle on that. And so people get tantalized because Shanahan puts him in for a couple of plays that are absolutely suited perfectly for his skill set, right? And that's not going to extrapolate to 60 plays in a game. Now, the issue with Shanahan here is, and this is not new. He is one of the most conservative decision makers in the NFL, but he's got a flat brim hat on and he's young. And so we all just assumed he's out there running and gunning and getting wild, right? And it's the same thing with Cliff Kingsbury. So he's really just a high rent Cliff Kingsbury at this point, where at 4th and 1 at the 50, you have the toy, right? So it isn't Trey Lance should start. It's no, let's give me 8 to 10 snaps from Trey Lance. Let's get him in there in short yardage in the red zone when you want to do more things to open up the run game. But if you don't trust the run game because the offensive line isn't necessarily where it needs to be, and maybe the running back is a little uncertain, right? And you can imagine what maybe mesh handoffs might look like between Lance and Sermon, right? 2 rookies out there. That's got fumble potential written all over it. And I imagine Shanahan right now is sitting there. I don't think he likes Jimmy G either, right? It's a reason why they traded up and drafted a quarterback. That right there was a red flag on Jimmy G. I don't think he wants Jimmy G in there, but I also think he's smart enough at least to look around at practice and have conversations with Trey Lance and go he's just not ready. It's just not going to be as good as the Jimmy G run offense. And it sucks that sometimes he fumbles and sometimes it looks sketchy, but a lot of quarterbacks at times when they turn around, they're supposed to run a play and all of a sudden the defensive lineman's already there. It's that dude is not supposed to be there. And so he doesn't necessarily have that next level awareness to know that guy is not supposed to be there, and is there. And it's we beat him up for that because he is just better than average instead of really, really awesome. And we assume Trey Lance is going to be really, really awesome. And I'm just here to tell you, I promise you, he's not going to be really, really awesome this season. Let's see it next year, whatever, right? We just talked about Tua and Jacoby Brissett being sort of an equal, right? Tua is far more polished than Lance is. And so everything, from a Lance standpoint, we just have to be a little more patient and we just have to give Jimmy G a break a little bit. And we need more out of Shanahan. We need more out of the offensive line for that team to tighten things up. And I think they do this weekend, by the way. So everybody just remain calm out there.
Yeah. Your overall point, I totally agree with that. Clearly, if Trey Lance was ready, he would be in the game more. And the part I think people miss, and, obviously this is just because I follow the Niners a lot more, but their offense, as you mentioned, is super, super, super complex. And I remember there was a story that came out last year about with the running backs, you have to take a test on the Saturday to make sure that you know the playbook. And if you don't pass that test, you don't play, right?
Yeah.
So that's what's going on in an NFL team with their running backs on a week-to-week basis. So imagine what it's like for a quarterback who, as you mentioned, hasn't played a full season of football in over a year.
Yeah.
Right. So
you remember Sermon didn't even play in the first game, right? And everybody's like, why is he not playing? Like, what's the deal there?
Yeah.
Like, you make that point. Maybe he failed the test the day before, right? Totally. And Elijah Mitchell didn't, right? You don't think they would want a relatively high draft pick to start in that game, right? But rules is rules, right? Exactly. And so, there's so much going on there that you need a veteran presence. And if they think Trey Lance can be that guy down the road, that's why they made that pick. Because, if he can do the stuff, if he can run everything from a mental standpoint with his talent level, now we're talking, right? And of course, people make the Colin Kaepernick comparison, but it's like people have figured out how to stop the read option, right? That every team does that. Mm-hmm. And 10 years ago or whatever that was, it's like that was still relatively fresh in the NFL. And he was a next level athlete, maybe even a better athlete than Trey Lance, at least from a running standpoint. So yeah, I mean, patience is necessary here. I know it's tough to watch sometimes, but these bad plays happen, right? They happen. So
let me ask you this on the flip side of that, right? The calm in terms of Niners and from a gambling perspective, it's like, relax, they're still okay. There might not be the elite of the elite, but that's a still really good football team on a week-to-week basis when we're talking about it from a gambling perspective. I'm curious about your thoughts on the Packers, who actually won the game, and we haven't even mentioned that side of it yet. Or is it just because we're just it's Aaron Rodgers? That was just Aaron Rodgers doing Aaron Rodgers type things. And so it's we take that for granted.
Listen, take it for granted. Maybe some people do that. It's just more take it for, just something that just exists, right? Yeah. We'll talk about sort of the idea of teams and betting and what you're going to expect from them on a week-to-week basis. For the Packers, it's a very tight range of expectations, right? It's okay, we know what we're going to get. And then, because we know what we're going to get from the offense by and large, right? Obviously in week one, not necessarily the case. And so it's well, why did they win that game? And if you're telling me anything other than Devontae Adams and Aaron Rodgers, right? I'm not hearing it, right? Because the defense was good enough, especially in the first half. But as much as, we just spent talking about the woes of San Francisco, if Kyle Juszczyk gets tackled on the 1 yard line and they require an extra 10, 15 seconds to score that touchdown, 49ers win that game.
Yeah,
right.
Totally.
So it's for all of the whatever, because they were down for so long, I'm not going to give the Packers a ton of credit on defense, right? They held up for a quarter and a half or so, or 2 quarters. But, again, that was why it was so frustrating that Shanahan didn't go for it on 4th and 1 a couple of different times, but certainly, at midfield when it was 10-0. So then you go, okay, what about it's just the Packers, right? It's just Aaron Rodgers. He's throwing dimes, right?
We're not being swayed.
He's also forcing San Francisco to have no chill back there, right? The guys are panicking and taking PI penalties as well. And that's Rodgers related. So yeah, it is. It's okay, this is what you're going to get with Rodgers. Does it mean they're going to win every game? They're going to cover every spread? No, because if San Francisco had done anything offensively in the first half, they probably win that game. But again, things go awry the way that they do. And you needed, strangely enough, you needed Juszczyk to fall down on the 1 yard line to win that game, which again is sort of counter to what you'd expect because, the Chargers and the Chiefs had the same issue. It's you gave my guy, Patrick Mahomes, too much time. He's going to burn you. Same exact thing with Rodgers. And so, that going in, and that's what you fear every single week.
Beautiful segue there, my dude, as we switch gears to some big boys going down. And you mentioned the Chiefs losing, the Bucs also losing. What's your biggest takeaway from those losses there by 2 Super Bowl contenders?
Yeah, I mean, just fundamentally, right? The cream of the crop isn't as far ahead that we think, right? Because we look obviously at the Bucs and the Chiefs, and they're the favorites coming into this season because they were in the Super Bowl last year. And guess what? That kind of happens all the time, right? We take the teams who are in the Super Bowl, and if nothing crazy happens, no radical changes occur, we make them the favorites, right? We give them all sorts of credit, and I, put them atop my ratings and all of that sort of thing. And then you have to watch a few games to see like what are the fatal flaws. And we've talked about the Chiefs' fatal flaw, defense, and that obviously was the case, right? Like again in the Chargers game, as the Chargers were basically able to go up and down the field, they start throwing interceptions and turning the ball over as well. And so you had a really low end performance from the Chiefs. As for the Bucs, right? Like, is it just a bad matchup? Maybe, right? Because the Rams worked them over. We talked about that going into that game and why we like the Rams in that game. Because again, sometimes you just look at last year's stuff. We just talked about with like the Cowboys and the Eagles. Because a lot of times it's coaching, right? As much as we get excited about the plays that these guys make and the talent in the fantasy football aspect of like, I love this guy and this guy's, going off and going for on his auction price for $28 and this guy's going for 40 and whatever. And we price all these guys out, but it's like the coaches are the ones who are making these moves, right? And for whatever reason, the Rams moves offensively work really well against the Bucs defense. And it's maybe because now that they have Matt Stafford, but it was the same thing with Jared Goff, where they just go, we're not even going to bother to run against the Bucs, right? That's what we talked about. You don't run against the Bucs. And so, they're built to beat certain teams in that way.
Yeah.
But if you can throw on the Bucs, just like if you can throw on anybody, right? This era of the NFL, like you're going to be in decent shape. And so in both cases, it's like both have to be dropped a little bit. Chargers are a very legitimate team, right? We've been sort of waiting on them to have that game where they convert inside the red zone. They did that. And the Rams are obviously a legitimate team as well. And so when we talked about, okay, are the Bucs going to go undefeated? It's like, no, they're not. And this certainly seems like a game that at the end of the year, we'll look back and go, yeah, makes total sense that they lost that game, right? Same thing when it comes to the Chiefs and Chargers. We talked about Mahomes. He often gets slowed down by what the Chargers do defensively. And it's not just a personnel thing, right? It's not because they have Joey Bosa. It's because they operate in a certain way that makes Mahomes have to be, he has to have patience, right? And even the best quarterbacks run out of patience and just kind of fire the ball down the field at times. And they were all over it when he did that. So, again, obviously not surprising because we had both of those teams to pull the upset over the weekend. So, I'm not going to beat up the Chiefs or the Buccaneers too much because it's not crazy or whatever. It's really just more saying, okay, Rams and Chargers need to be included in, if not the first tier, certainly the second tier. And I think we were a little slow on the Chargers because of the way, these games have gone in the first couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I mean, matchups are key. You mentioned coaching is key. And despite the fact the Chargers won that game, they messed up. Like, it looked like the same old Chargers. Like, I almost had to check the sidelines and make sure Anthony Lynn wasn't still, like, hovering around on the sidelines there. Because the end of the game was just kind of like, what are you doing? What was that game plan? But end of the day, take the wins when you can get them. Understand the matchups in terms of some teams just fit better against other teams. And we move on and we continue. But another thing that we love to do on this pod is discuss overall seasonal themes, right?
Yeah.
So what are some of the teams that no one wants to play one week and then likes the next week?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like that is our overall theme. So when you look at the board, you have to go, okay, we've used the Saints, right? The Saints have actually worked out incredibly well. And we were actually on that really, really early, right? Obviously we're on them to beat the Packers, And then we said, okay, it's not going to be as good next week because the range of possibilities, for all of these teams. So when I talk about ratings, like moving a team up or downgrading, right? That's sort of an average of your range, right? So let's use any team, we can use the Chiefs, we can use the Packers. We talked about the Packers having really a tight range, but the Saints are a team that might have a really large range, right? Any given week, they can look like an 80 out of 100. If they are healthy, right? If the offensive line is healthy and ready to go, if the defense is healthy, as long as Alvin Kamara's out there, there's always some capability from an offensive standpoint. And if they can play within the structure that Sean Payton requires offensively, Jameis isn't going to do anything crazy. And so they'll be at the top end of whatever their range happens to be. But the problem is, if things get a little loose and maybe some injuries pile up, the bottom half of their range becomes an issue, right? And that's what we saw in week 2. And so if their range hypothetically is 50 to 70, Sometimes they can play like a 70 out of 100 team, like in week 1. Sometimes they can play like a 50 out of 100, like a week 2 team, right? And that's where you have to sort of handicap the concept of, okay, well, which version are we going to see? And so last week, we probably got a middle ground type edition of the Saints, but we probably got the worst version, speaking of range, of the Patriots, right? So against the Jets, maybe they look like a 70, but against the Saints, you come back and you go, oh, this team's more like a 50. Now, they're not a 50 all the time. They're probably just a 60 that can play up and play down depending on different circumstances, matchups, injuries, et cetera, right? And so, as we look at all of that and we look to the next week, if a team just played really high up on their range, right, the expectation is a regression to the mean. Now, maybe they just regress to their average range of their range, or maybe they go all the way to the other side. And that's what we see with the Saints, right, where they're swinging back and forth, where the Packers are just like, they're just always a 65. Right? Because of the defense is going to keep them from being an 80, and Rodgers is going to keep them from being a 50. So their range is between like 60 and 70, right? Like it's a very tight, a possibility of outcomes there. And so when you're looking at handicapping games, you go, okay, well, which version of X team or Y team are we going to get this week? Right. So, and also what is the market thing? So using the Saints as an example, because they have been such a perfect example for this, they're headed home, right? And people are going to be like, oh, in the dome, like it's going to be electric, blah, 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 blah. And so the assumption is that they're going to play at the top of their range again, right? Whereas for me, I look at it and they just had Teron Armstead, their left tackle. He's now on injured reserve, or he's out for a few weeks. They've been missing their center. And if you look at that game against the Patriots, right, like great news, like we had them outright, that was awesome, blah, blah, blah. But you look at that game and there was a pick 6 from Mac Jones. Okay, relative outlier type performance there. And there was a full-on YOLO Jameis Winston moment, right? And it's on all the highlights because it gets converted. He throws one up, and on both ends of the play, right, people are getting tackled while trying to do their job. But that's a play that is an interception, with the Bucs. That's an interception the vast majority of the time, right? That's an interception if Jimmy G is throwing it, right? And so you go, okay, like that's 2 touchdowns that were pretty outlier type scenarios that if they go the other way, we're talking about a much closer game. And so, we'll talk more about this later on in the week, but I expect a lower end performance from the Saints. Now, the problem is they're playing the Giants, right? And so what's the Giants range? Because the Giants range is further back, right? Like they are, a 30 to 50 type of a team, right? They might look closer to mediocre if, 50 obviously being average. If they're closer to mediocre in that situation, then okay, like maybe the Saints are also playing the mediocre version of themselves, at which point you've got yourself a really close game. But if the Saints bring it and they're a 70 and the, Giants are, the Giants we saw last week or in week 1 and they're a 30, then that's when you get into a blowout, right? But all of those things are sort of, have potential. When you see a team upset a team outright, it's because they've played as good as they can possibly play. And the other team is probably playing as worse as they can possibly play. So take that into account when you're looking at the board this week and just go, okay, like who's going to play atop their range and who's going to play at the bottom of their range? You don't even necessarily have to make ratings on your own. Those are certainly helpful. You will find those incredibly helpful, but just sort of understand, okay, like, am I going to get the best of this team or the worst of this team, and why? If you can answer the why to why a team might play really, really well or might not play very well at all, then that's a really great head start. And that's why we've had a lot of success at the start of this season.
So yes, even with all that said, with everything that happened this past weekend, there's always one last angle that we like to discuss. When we talk about the Ravens, are they the bad beat of the week?
You know what? It's funny, right? Because normally we think of it from an against the spread standpoint. From a bad beat standpoint, everybody who didn't have the Ravens in Survivor suffered a bad beat there, right? Because 10% roughly of the big Vegas Survivor contest, but probably the same ratio in your Survivor contest at home. had the Ravens, and those people got away with one, right? A 4th and 19, a missed delay of game penalty, and of course a 66-yard kick by the great Justin Tucker, who absolutely deserves to have the record, right? He's the best kicker for my money of all time. And so for him to bomb that, not that surprising, even though I don't think that record's ever getting broken. It's never getting better than 66, unless we get into full like robot territory, which, will probably happen long after we're gone, especially if bad beats keep rolling up. So, I think it's actually kind of like the greatest moment in teaser history, right? If you sort of look at it that way. So a really good win for the tons of people that teased the Ravens down from 7.5 down to 1.5, and they win by 2, and they cover those teaser legs, which on a week like this had a lot of teaser legs winning, right? So it probably kept some things alive that ended up winning or even clinched some teasers out there. So whether it was the Ravens running around like crazy out on the field for the second straight week, or people at home who teased the Ravens running around their house, obviously that was a really great win for them. So maybe not necessarily a bad beat unless you're one of the 90% like me who didn't have the Ravens. If somebody who goes on to win Survivor who had the Ravens this week, that's one that they're going to circle for the rest of their lives. But yeah, nothing in the way of a bad beat unless you're sitting there with your arms folded like I was, bummed out that more people didn't get knocked out of Survivor this week.
Well, as we switch gears to the NCAA, I know there's definitely not a game in which you were necessarily sitting there with your arms folded. Maybe your arms were up. And especially when I look at an 11-6 record in terms of what you gave out last week in the NCAA and the thing that we call our hurry up offense picks. But that doesn't even include the biggest upset of the college football season so far. And that was NC State over Clemson. You were all over that one. What a ride that game was. But what was it that you saw coming into the game and then was actually executed in terms of NC State beating Clemson?
Yeah, and listen, from a point spread standpoint in college football, right, you get lower level teams knocking off higher level teams, but those aren't top 10 type teams, right? So you get the occasional like 4 touchdown upset. We even saw Oregon as 14.5 point favorites, or underdogs, if you will, knock off Ohio State. But like Oregon was a top 10 team going into that game, right? So we were probably giving Ohio State way too much credit in that instance. So when you're talking about sort of biggest upset of the year, it's like anytime Clemson goes down to a team that isn't Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State, and like maybe Oklahoma, right? It's a really big deal. But here's the thing, whether it's NFL football teams, but certainly college football teams, we talked about the idea of range with the NFL. In college football and, sports in general and society in general, right? People are going to tell you who they are. Right? They're going to show you who you are. It is up to you to believe them. Men, women, college football teams, they are going to tell you who they are. And so we talked about this last week, right? Like Clemson was just telling us who they are. They're like, you know what? We're not that great offensively. We have way more talent than the other teams do. So defensively, we're probably going to shut you down. But if you have somebody capable, we might be in a little bit of trouble here. Right. And so it comes down, the NC State kicker is missing kicks left, right, and center. And you're like, can we put a dagger into this Clemson team? And then it goes to overtime and NC State gives up the touchdown to Clemson, but they obviously get their chance and they get a touchdown and then they immediately get another touchdown. And it's just the greatest time we've ever had in our lives. So it's the headliner, right, of upsets from this past week. And it throws the dagger into Clemson from a national championship standpoint. But more importantly, as we talked about last week, right? We try to throw a few extra bets here, especially on the Tuesday episode when, maybe there's not necessarily a ton to bet on. We talked about the idea of the ACC potentially being up for grabs, right? And it was the idea of, okay, whether it's this week or some other week, Clemson's going to trip up. And what that's going to do is going to do one of two things. One, it's going to show us that Clemson's just not that great, so that even if they make the championship game, they are certainly beatable. And two, if it happens to a team like NC State, right, then that means that NC State now has to lose 2 games in the league for them not to make the championship game over Clemson. Obviously, if it's somebody else entirely, that's great too. But that's the big deal, right? It means that Clemson's going to be, really up against it for making the championship game. And so we grabbed Virginia Tech at plus 300. There was some 310s out there last week because they're in the other division. And what that means is, they obviously would face either Clemson or the Clemson replacement, if you will, in the championship, which if it's anybody other than Clemson, Virginia Tech plus 300 would be great value. Now you're saying, well, how do we know that it's going to be Virginia Tech? And the problem is we don't know. But what we do know is that they've already beaten North Carolina, which is the other really good or allegedly really good team in the ACC. And so they have the same setup that North Carolina State now has, where they are sitting there going, oh, okay, like we got a really legitimate shot here because we are essentially a game and a half above the next best team, if you will. Now, North Carolina lost again this week, so Virginia Tech's way ahead of them now, and it's a different team, that we have to worry about, or some other team that we have to worry about when it comes to messing with Virginia Tech. So we've got Virginia Tech plus 300 to win that division, and of course, you could have bet them for the ACC in general. You can still bet NC State for the ACC in general. Now, if you're sitting there, you're going like, I missed out on the really big number because, we should have bet this before Clemson, they beat Clemson. You can take the money that you made betting on the NC State money line and you can roll that over on NC State. So if they were, 25-1 to win the ACC before last week, and now they're only 8-1, well, you have a plus 300, right, that you just took. So take your initial investment plus the 3-1 that you ended up winning, take all four of those units, right, the initial one plus the 3 that you won, and roll it on to NC State at plus 800. And that ends up being 32-1, right, which is still better than the price that it was last week. So you didn't miss out on anything if you hit the NC State money line. If you didn't hit the NC State money line, obviously things get a little bit different, but you have this whole world opened up to you now in the ACC where a bunch of different teams can win. Maybe that's Wake Forest. Maybe Miami somehow shows us something that we didn't think that they were necessarily capable of, and we still don't really. There's a bunch of different options there because that is wide open. And that was the fundamental point last week when we talked about Clemson being vulnerable, and we were able to take advantage of it right away by having NC State win that game.
I like it. Crazy games going on. There are some other upsets as well as Notre Dame beat Wisconsin. That sets up a big matchup this week, which we'll obviously get to on the Friday pod, I assume.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Massive.
One of the things we're going to talk about. But one of the things we always do on the Tuesday pod as well is discuss the Heisman watch and maybe some other futures. Can we quickly go through those?
Yeah, I mean, this is Heisman weekend, essentially, right, when it comes to the marketplace, because you have the two favorites in some sketchier books. Both of them are minus favorites. I don't know how that's possible necessarily. Don't bet. If you ever go and you see Matt Corral and Bryce Young as both minus favorites at your sports book, not only avoid that market, just run for the hills from that sports book in general, because that is suspect. But the point is those two guys are leading the way right now in the odds market because there just isn't any other option, right? We talked about Clemson, right? And DJ was a guy who was up there in the marketplace. Sam Howell, right? North Carolina just lost. Spencer Rattler, they're barely surviving over there in Oklahoma, and he's not looking particularly great. CJ Stroud with Ohio State, right? There's a bunch of people in that collection that have already basically self-ejected from the Heisman candidacy, right? And JT Daniels is still up there, but there's no way JT Daniels is going to win the Heisman Trophy. And so that's why we're sitting here with our Desmond Ridder tickets going okay, this is a pretty good spot to be in, because whether it's that game against Notre Dame, and that's the feature focus, right? If he shows out, he throws his hat into the ring. Meanwhile, Corral and Young, now listen, that game might be 52-50, and they both, throw for 500 yards, and they both don't move from that Heisman market, right? Maybe Corral has a nice game anyway, even in a loss. I mean, they are 2 touchdown underdogs.
Yeah. But
there's a reason to believe that one of those two guys is probably going to come out of there as the favorite. And there's a decent chance that, listen, if Alabama loses, Bryce Young's going to get blamed for it, right? Even if it's 52-50, that's just kind of how things work over with Alabama. And there's a decent chance that Alabama wins by 3 touchdowns and that their defense, being an Alabama defense, corrals wait for it, corral, and now he's out of it, right? And so if that's all happening while Desmond Ridder is beating Notre Dame at Notre Dame, which, by the way, they opened as short favorites in that game at Notre Dame, which it's still it's been dicey for Notre Dame, but it's an undefeated Notre Dame team. So again, if he shows out while this is all going on, right, it could turn into a 2-horse race. Whoever survives the Alabama Ole Miss game and Desmond Ridder, and now all of a sudden, you've really got something interesting going forward when it comes to the Heisman race. So, a lot of these bets, right, especially in the future, sometimes, it's not that it comes down to something happening early on in the season, but it certainly puts into focus whether or not you have a chance to win, right? So we talk about the Chargers beating the Chiefs. If you bet the Chargers in any sort of future capacity, that was a really good indicator of whether or not you have a live bet. And so that's what's happening with the Heisman this week with our Desmond Ridder bets. I'm super excited about it. Going to be a lot of fun. As far as the Wisconsin Notre Dame game is worth mentioning. We talked about Wisconsin 12-1 to win the Big Ten last week. Don't get too bummed out if you bet that because they lost to Notre Dame. One, it has nothing to do with the Big Ten standings, right? Which is the only thing that matters when it comes to this bet. And two, if you close your eyes at a certain point in that fourth quarter, Wisconsin was up 13-10, right? I know the score was 41-13 because things got super weird late, but that Wisconsin team, other than the fact that Graham Mertz stinks, which we kind of knew already, right? Like, it doesn't mean that they can't beat Iowa at home later on in the season, right? Those two things don't really have anything to do with each other. So don't freak out if your sportsbook, speaking of books, right? If your book adjusts Wisconsin off of 12-1, if they make them 15-1, 16-1, so on, go ahead and bet it, right? Like, that didn't change anything other than just perception, right? And that's the thing we're looking to take advantage of here. So go ahead and bet that at a better number than 12-1 if that's available to you.
I like it, man. I like it. But let's get to some more picks because Thursday night, we always know there's some action in both the NCAA and in the NFL. Let's start with the NCAA since we're here anyways. And we got Virginia at Miami. And we'll talk about what the plague is right now at the Hurricanes program, as even your man's like Kurt Herbstreit's out here going in on Miami on Saturday, which everyone's kind of like, whoa, what's going on here? But anyways, Miami is 4-point favorites at home to Virginia. Where is your confidence at exactly with Miami right now in relation to that line?
Yeah, I mean, this game is strange as it sounds, right? It's an ACC game, but it's not as exciting to me as App State Marshall was last week, right? Like I'm like, Marshall +7, like this is a thing that's happening. They have the better quarterback, like they might be the better team. This is great news. This one's obviously a lot more confusing, right? Because you've got Miami, and Miami is a straight fade across the board this season and kind of always has been for me, with the exception, especially after the App State game. So, congratulations on the 69-0 win to Central Connecticut State last week, right? Like, I don't know that you ironed anything out other than the fact that every single player, even the deepest person on your bench, was better than every single player on the other team. So okay, fine. So to me, this is fade Miami, i.e. bet Virginia here or nothing. Now, the problem is once Kirk Herbstreit finally has an opinion, then, you're actually going to see some overreaction here potentially, right? And so Miami now goes down to -4 here at home against Virginia. Night game. Like, this should be a game that Miami wins, right? Last we saw Virginia, they were getting upset by Wake Forest last week. So it's not like this Virginia team, like we're dying to bet them either. So there isn't necessarily a strong play here. It's really more just like, if you had to bet something, I guess it's taking the points with Virginia, but like, you have to understand that like the market has adjusted to Miami. And so if there's anything left of Miami that people, the reason why people were liking Miami, why they were 6.5-point favorites to Michigan State, why they were 8.5 to App State, et cetera, et cetera. If there's anything that left there, it should come out on Thursday after getting called out on a national level. So, I mean, this is by and large a stay away game for me here. So, but it's still interesting, right? It's still an interesting watch, even if it's not there isn't a massive lean or a play for sure in the way that something like Marshall and App State last week was for me.
And we finish, of course, with Thursday night football, the Jags and Bengals. And for this matchup, remember, you can always get a full breakdown at drf.com/sports, where our guy Scott Grambling has a preview on this game, but also got to shout him out because he had a big weekend in terms of his 6-pack picks in both the NFL and NCAA. So don't forget to check that out each and every week. And check out before Thursday night, you better be reading his preview on this game as well. But Bengals, 7.5-point favorite at home to the Jags. You got two like high profile young quarterbacks there.
Yeah.
Trevor Lawrence was doing a little too much. We saw on the weekend. How hype does Jamar Chase look with Joe Burrow? There's lots of different angles there, but in terms of the 7.5 points for the Bengals, where are you looking here with this? Because that's a lot of points to lay.
Yeah. Let me put it to you this way. I'm going to turn this around for you. Okay. We talked about ratings early on in the podcast. So for you, for each one of these teams, right? Jacksonville and Cincinnati, we'll start with Jacksonville, right? Like out of 100, what would you rate this team as sort of their average state, with like 20 being the worst team in the league, 80 being the best team in the league, and sort of anything higher or lower than that is sort of best team of all time, worst team of all time, with 50 being like straight mediocre. So like, how would you sort of rate the Jaguars, taking out that they've lost all their games and all of that stuff and all of the like noise about Urban Meyer, like, how would you rate that team at this point?
At this point, I got to go with them at like a 30, maybe a 40, somewhere in that range.
Right.
So I guess that'd be like a 35.
Okay. That's totally fair. Yeah. And so I'm looking at this. Okay. So the other one, obviously Cincinnati, where would you have them? Right. So a little bit of excitement, should they have necessarily won that game against the Vikings in week 1? Didn't look so great. 3 or 4 interceptions against the Bears in week 2. And then they, rough up the Steelers, who knows what's going on there in week 3. So where do you have them on a scale of sort of 0 to 100?
I'm going to give them slightly better than the Jags, but not that much. I'll put them at like a 45 to 50, somewhere in that range.
Yeah, I think maybe you and I are on the same page.
Like
and I should say, like, we did not talk about this beforehand, right? And so when you sort of frame it that way, whether it's 35 and 45, like I even have it sort of 30 and 48-ish when it comes to Cincinnati, right? Like I think they're just a really average team right now, right? Capable of, being a little bit better than that, and certainly capable of being a lot worse than that. So with those two ratings sort of in conjunction, once you sort of feed them into the formula, if you will, for a point spread, I cannot get to 7.5 in this game, right? Like I top out at like 5.5. And so you go, okay, let's retrofit it a little bit here and go, how do we get to 7.5? Well, to get to 7.5, either you have to think that the Jags are a 25, like way down, like pretty much bottom of the barrel in the league. Now, maybe you're sitting there at home and you're going like, yeah, I've got them there, right? Like I have them right around there.
Yeah.
Or you need to get Cincinnati up to like close to a 60, which is a obviously better than average team. Now, I just don't see how either of those things are necessarily fair if, the Jets right now are like a 20 and the Texans are a 25. Now, I realize that the Texans beat the Jags, but I'm talking about the Texans version that is without Tyrod Taylor. So, if I have them sort of the 3rd or 4th worst team in the league here, showed a little fight, they're up 9 points against Arizona in that 3rd quarter. I just don't know how I can get to 7.5, because the other element is, what do we give Cincinnati for home field advantage? Because, the average right now is about 1.9. Mm-hmm. Well, I can't give them 1.9. That's a below average home field advantage for the Bengals. So if I'm only giving them around 1 point for home field advantage, and by the way, it's not like the Jags are going from some raucous home field advantage to the road where there's going to be sort of a second affectation on their part, I cannot get to 7.5, right? I can't even get to 7. I'm in like I said, 5.5, 6 range. So there, to me, is value here on the Jags. Now, it's a total hold your nose type of situation, but would you be that shocked if the Cincinnati Bengals, now I know we're getting to sort of narrative and branding and that sort of thing, if they ended up being the victim to the Jaguars this year, right? Like that's not that insane from a Jag standpoint. They're finally using Robinson in the running game. It's like, thanks for finally waking up to the fact that guy's a quality player. And they do have some talent on the outside. So can Cincinnati take advantage of the Jags' pretty brutal offensive line? Like Arizona could, right? Because they have a pretty good pass rush. right? Like that at least sort of makes some sense, right? Houston, they won for different reasons, but like, again, that was the first game of the year for Lawrence and that offensive line, right? They didn't play that much in the preseason. And so I'm just looking at this going like, I can't get to 7.5. I think there's value here on the Jaguars. And honestly, I'd be very careful if you were looking to play them, the Bengals in Survivor. Like this kind of feels like money line potential because of the variance that both these teams provide, right? Like they have pretty wide, a wide array in their range, right? We haven't seen it from the Jags, but it doesn't mean it's not there.
I got you. And I'd feel a lot more comfortable taking the points for sure. So I'm totally with you there. And hey, I love the Tuesday pods. I really do, especially when we're doing a little bit of celebrating as we were doing on this week. I know it's not always going to be like this, but as mentioned earlier, I'm going to take it when I can get it. And thanks again for joining us here, Matt. Where can the people find you on social media for more of the great info and insight that you always bring each and every week on this pod?
Yeah, thanks, pal. At MRuss Authentic, MRUSS Authentic on Twitter. Anything that I write over at The Score is there. And of course, we're tweeting out this podcast left, right, and center as well for you, because you do a great job. Really proud of, everything that's going on here for you, man. And yeah, so check out anything out that I write for The Score. Hockey season's coming up. Probably should mention that. And maybe we don't necessarily talk a ton of hockey on this podcast, but certainly there's some people out there that are excited for hockey season. So check that out at MRuss Authentic for all of your football and hockey needs.
Oh yeah, that's probably because people don't want to just hear me just talk about Leafs, Austin Matthews, Leafs all the time. But hey, maybe I'll try and work on that. We'll figure some things out and work through that part as well. Appreciate you coming on, Matt.
Happy to do it, pal.
Thanks to Matt for coming back on the pod and blessing us with his picks and insight as always. But if you want to follow me online, you can do that on Instagram at Sheldon Alexander and on Twitter at Shell Alexander. But for more, you got to check out DRF Sports, which is a brand new project. And just in case you're not familiar with the letters DRF, Daily Racing Form has been around for over 100 years, giving you all of the horse racing information, data, and analysis. But now they're taking over the entire sports world. So if you want more coverage on football and basketball and MLB, basically every single game in sports, you got to head to drf.com/sports for all of the details and insights. The site has all of the data on every single game, including offensive and defensive stats, betting angles, line movements, key injuries, head-to-head team records, and of course, the best team stats there are. The DRF data is what powers our power trends. So if you want to see which trends our analysts have selected, follow us on Instagram and on Twitter. If you want access to the raw data, go to drf.com/sports for, again, the usual previews plus our deep dives into this podcast. However you want your betting information, we've got you covered. Thank you for tuning in to this DRF Sports Podcast. I'm your host, Sheldon Alexander, joining you every Tuesday and Friday. But for now, until next time, see ya.
Thanks for listening to the DRF Sports Podcast. Please subscribe, rate, and review the show. For more sports betting advice, go to drf.com/sports and follow on Twitter at DRF_sports.